Hey everybody, welcome to the Voxology podcast. I am your host, Mike Erre, with my co-host, Tim Stafford. We are delighted to be with you. We have been told repeatedly we have great voices for podcasting and great faces for podcasting. And so we're just happy to do that. Thank you. As always, we got so much feedback from LGBTQ episode and the Exile episode, and it's just amazing. And it's so fun to be a part of this community. I want to thank some folks that joined our Patreon team. I want to thank Courtney, and I want to thank Renee, and I want to thank Nathan. I want to thank Daniel. I want to thank Tyler. I want to thank Rick and JT. What a crew. My goodness, thank you so much. We are blessed beyond belief. And it's not just that it helps all of the expenses associated with this, but that you see value in it. Because we think it's important what we're all doing. And it's great to see that other people see that too. So thank you again for that. Today, we're just going to kind of cook straight into the interview. We're interviewing a guy that we've had on before years ago. Dan Koch is his name, and he had a podcast named Depolarized. Actually, we have an old episode in the archives that you can listen to way back in the day with sweet Andy Laura. And Dan's been doing some research on the subject of spiritual abuse, and particularly the kind of environments where this sort of abuse is most conducive, the kind of environments that make this conducive. And so we wanted to have a conversation about, and it's tough, and he does such a great job, Tim, nuancing, because abuse, that's a very strong term, and it can be over-applied and under-applied depending.
Totally.
And so we get into, I think, some stuff that loads of us are aware of and familiar with, but he kind of codifies it in a way that's helpful. And then there are 3 questions at the end of the interview that he brings up that I think are really, really good. And so, Tim, what did you think?
I thought it was great. I'm so curious. It's easy to point at finite, like, this is abuse, this person should not be in that position, et cetera. But like when the organism itself has developed itself to a point where it has abusive tenets as part of the foundation of it,
right?
That's such an interesting thing to tackle, because that's more than just rebuke or calling something out. It's like, how do you change an entire system that has decades or longer of foundational elements that have led to people being abused? So like we're definitely wrestling with that, with a lot of the do better stuff in Young Life, and I don't know, but there's a lot of conversations about how, and then he does a really good job too. I think it's interesting because we've had lots of conversations about calling and vocation on here. What does it mean to be called, and how you use God's name to say, God told me this, God told me that. And then in the instance of abuse, where it's like that's being used and God's the ammunition, or God's like the energy source to fund your abusive tactics. That's that's a really wild thing to think about spiritually. Yeah. Like trying to imagine that from God's perspective or something, where it's like, because you think about those verses of just like causing someone to stumble and how Jesus spoke to that.
Totally.
But like causing someone to stumble versus like causing someone to have existential dread in the name of God. Like if Jesus was like, hey, you caused little ones to stumble, I can't imagine what God's opinion is of you've caused existential dread in somebody about, I don't know. It's so big. And so I'm so fascinated as we continue to have conversations here in Auburn and on the podcast about like what church should be and how do we start to, like, if you can change that whole thing, or if we just, there's just so many ornaments attached to the tree.
Yeah. Good metaphor. And And if you want to exercise in sadness, take his 7 characteristics and just hold them up against the Sermon on the Mount, and you'll see how far we've fallen from what it is that Jesus called us to embody as a community. And so, but like us, Dan is super hopeful for the church, and he says some really profound things to people who are considering sort of working vocationally for a church. So anyway, we think it's great stuff. We're excited to have him on again, and here you go. Ladies and gentlemen, we have the pleasure to welcome our good friend Dan Koch back to the program. Dan, if there are some of you who've listened to all 300 plus episodes, you will remember that way back in the day, Dan, we had the pleasure of hosting Dan, and we were talking about his podcast, Depolarize, which was very unique in that space, and had a great conversation, and that's since been one of the more listened to shows in the back catalog of our podcast. And so we were stoked to have him back again. So Dan, hello. Thanks for your time today. Good to see you.
It's always great on a bright, sunny day to hop on a microphone and talk about lives being destroyed through spiritual abuse, you know?
Yes. Perfect. And unfortunately, we have too many examples and much to discuss.
Yeah.
Let's catch up just a little bit. So you were in the depolarized space, and then you moved on to. Did you move on? Were you still doing depolarized, and then you have permission?
So it goes depolarize, reconstruct, you have permission in that order, and they all overlapped to some degree. But now it's only you have permission for the last 2.5 years. Yeah.
Nice. And the space that sort of occupies, how would you describe it?
I would describe it as it's basically the overlap of a more progressive vision of Christianity and various social sciences. So psychology, sociology, anthropology, basically just like trying to take the world seriously, the modern world, while also taking Christianity seriously.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of that, all of that posture in the world has led you to grad school. So tell us just a little bit about, before we get into our topic, kind of what led you to that decision and what you're up to.
Yeah, so I assumed for a long time, I always knew I would go to grad school. I sort of have like a brain that wouldn't let me not eventually, you know, it just wouldn't shut up. But I thought it would be for theology because that's kind of what I've been interested in for over a decade. And it's what most of my podcast conversations were about when they weren't about politics, a la Depolarize. But even on Depolarize, a lot of times they were about theology. So I knew there was something there. Yeah. But they were also often about psychology. And as I was kind of discerning what to do with my career, getting a little stir crazy, being a commercial composer, someone recommended psychology, and I started thinking about it, and I was like, I think that's actually a better fit. And so now I'm halfway through my schooling toward a doctorate in counseling psychology, and I finished up basically the first half of my dissertation, which is the research that we'll be talking about today, on spiritual abuse, and I plan to see clients with an emphasis on, you know, those who have been spiritually abused or for whom religious change, loss of faith, maybe a partner lost faith, you know, anything, you know, I want to see pastors, just anything about that world is what I plan to sort of focus on in my clinical career.
Well, too bad you won't have many people to talk to. That'll be a very small.
It's insane.
Not really.
No, it's
So the focus of your dissertation is going to be spiritual abuse.
Yeah.
And you've been doing research along those lines. And so I've read a couple of times the doc you sent over. I'd love to just sort of walk it through with you, and anything you want to highlight, please stop and sort of plant on that. One of the questions I wanted to start with is what separates spiritual abuse from just I had a bad experience at a church? Like where does it cross over, do you think?
It's really it's unclear at this point. And I mean that both it's unclear in my own mind, but it's also unclear in the minds of I'm in contact with most of the spiritual abuse researchers who are alive. There aren't that many of them. And, one of them is on my dissertation committee. Another one I've interviewed and emailed with recently, So it's like there aren't a whole lot of people who know a whole lot about it at a high level of rigorous, careful thinking, right? There's a higher number of people who work with clients that are not researchers, but they are good with working with people who have experienced religious trauma. And so they would maybe give a different answer, and that would actually be interesting on its own. I haven't done that yet, and my conversations are mostly at the more academic level. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. You'd probably have fun getting someone on at some point who it's just what they do every day as they work with these clients, and they would have a very different perspective than me. I'll eventually also have that perspective.
I was going to say that will be you.
It will be me, but not for, I won't have the kind of years they would have for another 5 years or so. But basically, in fact, we sometimes talk about swapping out spiritual abuse or religious abuse for something like religious harm, spiritual harm. It's really more of a continuum. You can have... It's complicated in two ways. One way is that the intensity of the experience can be different. So you could, for instance, let's say you're in an abusive marriage. Your husband has hit you twice and has verbally abused you for years. You could talk to a friend at your church that you know and really love, and they could make a comment that they shouldn't make. Maybe they say something like, well, Jesus said that we should forgive 70 times 7, but at the same time, I recognize what you're going through, and it's a hard decision. Now, bringing up forgiving 70 times 7 in the context of being domestically and verbally abused, maybe not the best thing to do, but we would pretty much say that's not abuse. The friend left open the option but it's complicated, right? And so whatever. Now, contrast that, same exact situation. You have a meeting with the pastor, and the pastor says, Jesus says we can never divorce except for infidelity. So unless he cheats on you, you cannot separate, cannot divorce, you cannot press charges. You just you need to submit to your husband. I'm pretty comfortable saying that's abuse in any and every case, right? To sort of be that rigid in a situation with that much, frankly, crime being committed.
Right.
So that's one complicating. It's just how intense is it? Then there's another factor as well, which is that we know this from PTSD studies on combat veterans that multiple service people can experience the exact same event. One gets PTSD, the other doesn't. So there's there's a trauma resilience that we all have, and you don't really know that you have it until you find out, right? And in fact, one of the things they're trying to do in veteran psychology is actually figure out if they can predict that, to figure out who to send into the field or not, and who to have as a back office, job within the military, because that would be good information to know. But we don't really know how. We just know that that's true. So that's another factor of harm, abuse, or nothing. Just a kind of an annoying experience that might be really abusive or really traumatic for somebody else. So it is kind of complicated, and it's really a continuum.
Yeah, and the word abuse itself carries in our culture, and rightly, a connotation that's fairly heavy and significant beyond just, I don't like church people. Yeah,
you don't want to throw it around too lightly.
Right. But there's no doubt it happens. One of the things you've done is to Would you survey 6,000 people?
I surveyed,
what it was?
I surveyed 4,800 people, and
Like I said, 4,800.
3,200 of them actually completed the survey, and then 1,600 of them did what I have often done, which they look at it and they click to the first page and they're like, I don't feel like I have time for this right now, and then they pieced out.
Yeah.
But yeah, 3,200, which is for a student, survey is pretty incredible, and I'm very grateful.
Right. And one of the disclaimers I thought was interesting is these are people who may be more aware of spiritual abuse than the general population. Mm-hmm. But the results were still fascinating and disturbing.
Yeah.
I wanted to hit the underlying factors. I wanted that you identify 7 that kind of create an environment for this. Mm-hmm. So these are almost 7 things to be aware of if you're looking for a healthy church. So I just wanted to talk this through because I think that's a super practical takeaway because we get asked all the time, what should you look for in a church? And obviously they're the normal things. But because we're seeing so much carnage in the world, there are these leadership issues and leadership practices that seem to be assuming greater and greater importance. So I wondered if you could just talk us through and then pause wherever you want to and sort of hammer into something that you noticed.
Yeah. Well, how about I'll do this? I'll go through one by one and give you, 2 to 4 examples, and then get you guys to respond, and then we can move to the next one.
Yep. Sounds good.
For the nerds out there, this was done through a statistical process called factor analysis, where you basically have a bunch of items, and then the computer goes through and figures out which items clump together naturally. So if someone says this happened a lot, what else do they tend to say happens a lot? And the more people you have, the stronger those findings are. And with 3,200 people, it's pretty robust statistical work. I'll stop talking about stats now. That was it.
No. Anytime you're going to use the word robust next to statistical, I'm in. I am in completely.
I don't know that you can speak for listeners, though. That might just be a you and me thing, Mike.
Yeah.
So the first one, and I've labeled these, based on what it seems like they are. The first one is authoritarian leadership. So some examples of the type of things that cluster together here are being expected to consult your pastor about non-religious decisions, seeing specific church members being pressured to give money, even though it's known that they have financial hardship, pastors explicitly claiming to speak on God's behalf, and experiencing extreme pressure to become a pastor, missionary, or other spiritual leader.
Right. So there's an elevating of the position.
Yeah.
Beyond just the normal everyday, and there's a high degree of control trying to be exercised.
Yeah.
That's
right.
Right.
It's basically, a lot of the authoritarian leadership stuff you could file under narcissism.
Right.
But not all of it. There's also, like, if you notice with that pressure to become a pastor, missionary, or spiritual leader, there's an economy within this group where pastors and missionaries are truly at the top, and everything else is below, to where it would be expected to consult them about things that aren't related to church, moving, who you're going to marry, jobs to take. They're also under this is being expected, or giving up vocational goals or educational goals, or being asked to give them up by a pastor. Or you could even say sort of implicitly being told you should not pursue school. You should not pursue a career. You're a woman, maybe. And that would bleed into some of the gender discrimination stuff, which we'll get into later. But, it's authoritarian, basically. And it's one of the hallmarks.
Yeah.
So avoid Loki as a pastor.
Yes. Have you been watching the show?
Anyone who declares glorious purpose.
Yes. I have a new fondness for alligators without spoiling anything.
I'm a little behind on that show. I watched the first 2 or 3.
Okay.
But, one of the interesting items here that it might be worth just kind of chatting about, because it's kind of eye of the beholder thing is my pastor explicitly claiming to speak for God. And, there's different ways that pastors can do that. That's the item. So people filled that out as they understood it. But in talking with some people afterwards, it's like, well, a pastor might say, guys, I want to share a word that I have for you this morning that came to me in prayer. Right. That's not what I'm talking about. Someone could interpret it that way, but it'd be something more like, if you're out there and you live with your boyfriend or whatever, like God says you are in sin, right? Now, what's interesting about that is the Bible does not talk about cohabitation. God actually doesn't say anything about cohabitation in the modern world in the Bible. So God is not saying anything. You are saying something through the interpretive grid of your denomination or personal Bible study as a fallible person in a 4.5 billion year old universe with who knows how many other sentient species that God also loves and deals with, in a world where everyone that you would have agreed with 100 years ago thought it was wrong for black and white people to marry. So, no, God doesn't say that. You say that. And that can really mess with people, right? To say God says this when it's something that is unclear. Now, if we change the example to God says, I hate divorce. Yeah.
So there is something he says. Mm-hmm. How does that affect that dynamic? Because I can hear some pushback in my brain thinking, well, dude, the text says what the text says.
Yeah.
And if I'm quoting the text, you can't call that abusive.
Yeah, I would say, if you're quoting scripture and you're saying, God says in this verse blank, and you read it.
Right.
I have a lot less trouble with that. Now, depending on what that verse is, there are layers of interpretation that you may or may not be using. But if you're literally quoting God saying, I hate divorce, well, sure. I think God does hate divorce, right? Like in the basic sense. Now, this is what's so complicated about human language and interaction is the context of a church, right? The other context and what kind of messages get put out there. That one phrase, God hates divorce, I could imagine a Episcopal priest quoting that in a context where it's understood that people get divorced sometimes, but there's real fallout. There's fallout to children. There's financial fallout. There's relational fallout. It is not the kind of thing you would wish on anybody. I can also imagine that statement coming out of the mouth of an independent fundamental Baptist preacher who also says all kinds of other crazy stuff all the time that is going well beyond what the text explicitly says, and that in a culture that implicitly says God hates divorce so much that God's hatred of slavery, of abuse, of physical abuse, of hatred, all those things God hates less than divorce because we're fundamentalists, right? So it's always in context, and that context actually gives us a lot of information of how we interpret what the actual single sentence is that the pastor said.
Yeah. No, that makes sense.
Honestly, the best way to describe all these things is actually potentially abusive. That's the more accurate way. So I'm studying spiritual abuse, but any of these particular items that I'm talking about, these are all potentially abusive. They are not necessarily or always, with a very few exceptions, like pressuring someone to stay in an abusive marriage, I would say is always abusive. But most of them are not going to be that cut and dry. They're more potentially abusive.
Got it. All right, let's go to number 2.
Number 2 is violence, horror, and punishment. I'll give a couple examples, and then I'll tell this one is where my own interaction with this topic comes from autobiographically, so I'll say a little bit about that too. Actually, I'll start with that. Okay. So when I was in 6th grade, I was at a Christian school that was run by kind of maybe fundamentalists, but very conservative Anglicans. You don't normally get fundamentalism in Anglicanism, but there was some adult at that school. I can't remember if it was a teacher or a parent or a volunteer. They gave me a book that was called 96 Reasons Why Jesus Will Return in 1996. And it
Nice.
And it claimed September as the date.
Yeah.
And this was April of 1996.
Hold on. That's the sequel to 88
Yes.
Reasons.
Yep.
Jesus was coming back in 88.
Yeah,
Okay,
so
perfect.
88 sold like millions of copies and was a big thing. Then, of course, it didn't happen, and you got to imagine diminishing returns by the time you get to 1996. But it was in print. There was a book. It was like a little paperback, like a cheap little paperback.
Yeah.
And it was 6 months out, and I was in sixth grade. I was I was 12, almost 13. And
was this handed to you specifically, or was this something they were like, do you remember if it was
my unreliable
camp-wide?
memory from that time is that someone gave it to me specifically, which would make sense why I would have like taken it seriously, but I don't know. I could have just seen it lying around. And I had panic attacks. I was like, I'm not ready to die. I'm not ready for my life to be over. I'm 12 years old. I've never been naked with a woman. Even though I didn't really want to be in that way yet, I still was like so curious. And I have now comically specific memories praying to God, like, I won't have sex. I know that's wrong, but like, please just let me be in a room naked with a woman before you come back.
Wow.
Yeah. So
yes.
This is kind of more,
You're not the only one. You're not the only one who prayed that prayer.
I've heard multiple people have told me. So under this like violence, horror, and punishment thing, end time stuff taught to children can be some of that. Also, hell houses, terror or horror being used to motivate religious decisions. Also in this clump is seeing scripture used to justify physical violence of any kind or abusive parent-child behavior. Again, kind of in the eye of the beholder. Some people would consider like any spanking abuse. Some people wouldn't. Right. And then just, like talking about hell, Satan, and demons or the end of the world to young children when it's really developmentally inappropriate. That's kind of this violence, horror, and punishment factor.
And it seems like the issue of like, if the first one is the issue of control, this one's the issue of manipulation. Mm-hmm. It's like the only way, and I've had tons of conversations with people who literally say, well, if you take hell away, why would I follow Jesus?
Right.
And you're like, wow, we framed the whole thing that way. And I really resonate with this. Absolutely. It's a whole generation. And the Left Behind series fed into that. There was an old movie like, I don't remember what it was
Thief
called.
in the Night.
Thief in the Night. Yes, Dan.
And the A Distant Thunder, the sequel.
Ooh. Yeah. Ooh, I don't know that I saw A Distant Thunder.
You don't need to. I rewatched some of those, for research, and they're bad. Yeah.
Oh my goodness. It's so different. I mean, both the authoritarian, Jesus explicitly repudiates this.
Oh yeah.
In the Gospels. And this, oh my Lord, the only context he ever talks about Gehenna is to religious leaders. And he never uses it as a motivation for belief, ever. So that's just so striking.
Yeah, he uses it as a motivation for caring for the poor, basically.
Right, yeah. And to deal with injustice.
Yep.
I did not get that from Shauna, my wife, and I. Our first actual date was to one of those hell houses.
No way.
Oh, no. No.
Did it work?
No, I was actually a youth pastor at the time, and it had come up in conversations with parents. I was like, let's just go check this out. Like, I'm curious to see what they're doing. I mean, it was insane.
I heard I can't remember where I heard it, but somebody told a story of when she was a teenager and their church put these on. And one of the rooms was like a rave, because raves were so satanic. She's like,
no.
But the thing is, like, by the end of the night, it'd be a weekend that they would do these. So like by 9 or 10 p.m., as it's kind of winding down, all the volunteers would just end up like dancing in the rave room. As if it was a normal dance, which I think is like the ultimate. That's like the ultimate FU to the hell house.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. Oh, brutal.
Yeah.
We can spend so much time on that one, but I want to keep us
let's
keep us
moving.
going to number 3.
So the third one is discrimination, and for my actual scale, there was only enough. It's kind of boring sampling stuff, but I only have gender discrimination in my kind of final product.
Robust.
But racial and sexual orientation discrimination fall under this as well, and this is basically being denied opportunities to serve, being treated as less than. Just sort of generally because of one's gender, race, or orientation. And then I think with women in particular, there are some other kind of hues of this because it is so pervasive in a lot of the theology that, the way in which women are less than, it's a lot more, it's both more explicit and more implicit and more detailed than any kind of like racial discrimination would be, for instance, in the 21st century. And then orientation has its own kind of set of issues as well. There are ways that the true beliefs of the church are sort of obscured because it's unpopular to be clear about those. And then you can get in there for 6 months. You start to becoming a member, and all of a sudden you realize you can't even play on the praise team. So there's kind of a whole host of that. And then with women, of course, there's all the, where can you use your gifts? Can you use your gifts? Do you have to be in the kitchen or teaching children and all that stuff?
So would you say people who hold the theological position of complementarianism, does that make them discriminatory? Or is it how they hold that makes it discriminatory or not?
I would say simply having a complementarian view is not in itself discriminatory, because you can be a woman and have a complementarian view, right?
Right. That's what I was thinking of. Yep.
And so what I'm trying to capture here is sort of going beyond just having that view. So
totally,
a complementarian would hopefully say, I would never want a woman at my church to feel she was treated as less than. Especially if she agrees theologically. And yet we do know that people have that experience, and that's oftentimes why women no longer will be complementarian, is that their lived experience of it shows bad fruit, and so they move on. So this one is another one of those. It's slippery in terms of when does it become abuse, when is it frustration or merely harm. A lot of it's the eye of the beholder, but it's certainly an area where it can become abusive.
Well, I appreciate that, Dan. I really do. Some of these are really obvious, and you know them when you see them.
Yeah.
And I would imagine, I can imagine people thinking, well, crap, I can't say anything, that's not acceptable. Or I'm going to be, accused of abuse or whatever. And so I think the nuance you're bringing to this is super, super helpful. That it can be, it's not necessarily, but I can see, I've seen and had people who've experienced all the forms of these things and see sort of the fallout. So I just appreciate that. And that's why I keep going, well, hey, what about this?
Yeah.
And I am grateful.
No, you should.
That there's whole room. Because we do need to do lots of repenting and lamenting.
Yeah.
I just wouldn't want people to step out of the pastoral vocation. For simply fear of being called out, as abusive.
Step
for holding
into the pastoral
views.
vocation to lead the charge for healthy religious communities.
Come on, baby. I love it.
I am personally very pro-church, and I think that the peer-reviewed research backs that up. Some people who work in this world are either explicitly or implicitly basically anti-church, basically anti-Christianity or anti-religion. To some degree, they ascribe to the John Lennon Imagine school of thought that getting rid of religion will somehow make the world better. I think that that's insanely naive, and I don't think it's supported by any real research. But people have their own stories and they have their own hurt and trauma, and so I can empathize with that. But that's not where I'm coming from. I myself am a practicing Christian. The pandemic kind of slowed some stuff down, but plan to raise my son and any future children we have in the church, and Yeah. So that it's not about anti-church for me. It's about making communities even healthier and avoiding scandals and avoiding, of course, the fallout of those scandals. I mean, have you guys been devouring the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill podcast like I have been? The Christianity Today one. It's so good.
Yeah.
And I know personally, dozens of people who had personal fallout from that whole thing. And some of them were in therapy for years. And, it's like, that's the cost. I mean, the cost is real of this stuff. And it's also entirely antithetical to what the witness of the church is supposed to be, pointing to,
Totally.
the life and sacrifice of Jesus Christ. So, that's where I'm coming from.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it totally makes sense. All right. Medical care. This is an interesting one.
Yeah.
I would have thought this was just fringe groups, but the fact that this came up as one of the 7 is interesting.
Well, it is mostly fringe groups. There's sort of like, I was actually pleasantly surprised that, for instance, only 13% of my respondents reported medical care being postponed or not given at all for religious reasons, at least sometimes. And only 4% reported that happening often or all the time. So that kind of thing where people don't go to the doctor, they are prayed for instead, that's pretty rare, thankfully. But it does happen. It happens, especially in, like Jehovah's Witnesses will not do blood transfusions. Christian Scientist denominations will avoid all kinds of medical care.
Well, we saw a lot of this with COVID. I mean, that's where all of a sudden it was like, hey, Jesus is my vaccine. And I know that's not abusive per se, but there is that same impulse sitting behind it. Like somehow we can't trust
interesting
science, government, whatever.
Yeah, that's interesting. We could spend a couple minutes on that if you want. My sense of that is it's less about the kind of, so in these more extreme religious environments where they really are eschewing medical care, there's a kind of really thick view of God's providence in terms of like physical bodies, that like, and the efficacy of prayer and stuff like that, like a really robust sense of that. That is, I think, different than what you see with most sort of anti-vaxxers or vaccine-hesitant Christians, which I think actually has more to do with just loss of trust in institutions over time. Much of that is evangelicalism's own fault by building and propping up parallel evangelical institutions to rival the mainstream ones. You see it all the way from health insurance companies to publishing houses to record companies to curriculum to, everything. And so that's just a slow erosion of trust in standard institutions of which everybody is able to take part.
That's good. That's good. So maybe it's less about the spiritual teaching of in as compared to some of those extreme cases. That makes sense.
That's my guess. And I'm operating on an assumption shared by a lot of psychologists that the reasons we state for our actions are often not the reasons that we do them. Shocking, right? I know.
I am shocked. Now, I would, again, as a neophyte and totally uninitiated into your world, I would want to talk about the way Christians talk about mental illness under this rubric as well.
Yeah, so that's where it gets more common. So, for instance, 50% of my respondents reported being deterred from seeking mental health treatment, counseling, and or medication at least once or twice. And there was no gender difference. This is males and females. So there is some pervasive sense of like, you don't need counseling, you don't need therapy, you certainly don't need medication. I heard a story of a young woman who was actually, this was in one of the qualitative studies that I based all my survey items off of. So I read a bunch of these interview-based studies in the literature, and then I turned them into these survey items. That's how I kind of did my work. And this is from Paula Swindle's work, who's on my dissertation committee, and who's been a guest on You Have Permission a couple times. 2 of the spiritual abuse episodes are with her. And one of her respondents in her study was told that her depression was Satan, and that basically, I'm paraphrasing, so I hope I don't get this wrong, but taking medication was like opening the door up to the devil and the demonic.
Sure.
And like, she was just a depressed teenager who needed some help, you know?
Yeah.
That's abusive. I mean, that's bad. There are, of course, more implicit and less sort of violent versions of this that are just like, we'll just downplay the value of therapy. We'll downplay the value of marriage counseling, and you just go talk to your pastor. You don't need a therapist.
Yeah.
So there's shades.
You're qualified for everything.
It's a continuum.
Totally.
Yeah. You're qualified for everything.
I saw a very well-known Reformed pastor tweeting out, "Worry is a mild form of atheism."
Oh my gosh.
And it was just one of those, like, as they say in the South, bless his heart. Because that is not, but that speaks to that sort of low grade shaming of, hey, I'm in a situation that I cannot handle. I can't rein my worry in with Bible verses right now.
Right.
Like it's out of control. So and again, man, it speaks to this centering of the pastor as the source for knowledge, and
I think there's tough, a relationship there. If you think that it goes both ways, like the causality can go either way, right? On the one hand, you've got pastors are more valuable than doctors or therapists, and on the other hand, you have like what the pastor. This is because the pastor has access to spiritual power, which is stronger than any earthly power that maybe a doctor or a therapist might have, right? Or something like that, science. And we mentioned institutions, lack of trust in the scientific community has continued to increase in evangelical circles over the decades, as there's more and more perceived antipathy between evolution and other kinds of science and like more literal textual approaches to the Earth's history, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's an interesting kind of, push and pull, or rather, I guess just a relationship between those two things that you're picking up on.
Yeah. And then, of course, moving to the next section, the self-protective nature of the institutions.
Yeah, so this factor I call abusers over abused. And it's basically, it's a constellation of issues that just take the power, position, the word, the welfare of the abusers more seriously than that of those who are alleging abuse, the victims. And this can manifest in a few different ways. One of them is like being pressured to forgive an abuser while the abuse is ongoing. So the idea of forgiveness can really be twisted here. I would argue that biblical forgiveness requires actual repentance first. But if abuse is ongoing, then that's obviously not happened. There's been no space. There's been no proof that this is ending. So that would be, in my view, a really unhelpful and damaging use of forgiveness. Seeing leadership or a group itself protecting or even elevating abusive individuals or people who have had credible abuse allegations, right? Maybe because they are good at fundraising or they pack the auditorium. Also here is the experience of my church community abandoning me in a difficult time. And I think that that's maybe a little more subtle, but it really does relate to this idea of, well, I was going through something rough and my church was not there for me. That could be for different reasons, but I think in some cases it certainly could be because whatever I was going through, that was difficult was in some way against the program of the church. Like Driscoll in the podcast, he's quoted as saying, like, the bus is going to keep moving. You can either get on the bus or you can get off the bus. But when someone points out,
I think he says you can get on the bus or get run over.
By the bus, which is a very apt metaphor. So if the bus...
Straight from the lips of Jesus.
Exactly right. If the bus is running over people, well, actually, it might be good to sort of pump the brakes on the bus, right? And so that's the relationship there. And then also there's victim blaming. So being blamed for the harm that I suffered rather than blaming those who actually harmed me. So that's that constellation of abusers over abused.
And that sort of results in the next section, which is internal distress.
Yeah.
Right. So you package all that together, and how do people come away from church?
Yeah. So the best way to think about this is those first five areas are external. So these are things that we experience. They basically happen to us. And then the last two, internal distress and a harmful God image, are internal. So the first five are potentially spiritually abusive events, and then the last two are what results from those experiences. These are what happens to a person. So internal distress is like feeling isolated, feeling a lack of self-worth, feeling sadness over the loss of your faith community, feeling a lack of spiritual direction or purpose, having trouble navigating life outside your church, avoiding religious settings to avoid distressing feelings or panic attacks, stuff like that.
Yep. No, totally.
This is what we would call trauma, basically. The word for, a lot of this is trauma and the after effects of trauma.
Right. So I can't even be associated with X, Y, or Z because of what it does internally.
Yeah. When I think of this, I have a panic attack. And this is actually this is the most pernicious thing about spiritual abuse in my mind, is that it's like going to the hospital and you get your arm broken at the hospital and they don't put it in a cast. And then for the rest of your life, you're like, I'm not going to go to a hospital to get better. That's where my arm got broken. They broke it. So the hospital, and the reason I use that metaphor, which is my buddy Evan Rosa's metaphor, is that...
I know Evan Rosa.
Yeah. Oh, you know Evan?
From Biola.
Yeah, from Biola. Yes. Yeah. Now at Yale. So he's, that's his metaphor. When he interviewed me, he brought that in, and I've been using it ever since.
Oh, dude, totally.
But like, one thing we know from the rigorous peer-reviewed literature is that religious communities and spirituality are both associated with better outcomes of healing from trauma. Generally speaking, from war trauma, from sexual abuse, from any kind of trauma, child abuse. And so we're cutting off potentially possibly the main source of healing that a religious person would use were they to be abused.
Oh, so true.
It's a double whammy because they're now going to have a harder time accessing their faith community, their relationship with God, to heal from the abuse we inflicted on them.
Well, and it's a triple whammy because the last thing you identify is that then that gets translated to God and what God's like.
Right. And so this final one, harmful God image, is one of the most interesting to me because this is where things really get twisted. Paula Swindle, who I mentioned, her dissertation is called A Twisting of the Sacred. That's the kind of metaphor she uses. And once we get to these items, I feel betrayed by God. I feel as if God harmed me directly and I distrust God. When we've gotten to that point, now we have totally flipped the script because in almost every form of Christian theology and spirituality, God is never the villain. God might allow something to happen, right? That's in a lot of Christian theologies, like God allowed that to happen. There will be some lesson from it. God's ways are not our ways.
Totally.
You know, we have ways of sort of not pinning it on God, but to say, no, God betrayed me. Like in most Christian theology, God is incapable of betrayal. God can't betray. We can betray God, maybe. We can betray each other. A pastor can betray me, but God can't betray me. And yet we know that this is an experience people have. It shows up in the literature. It shows up in carefully done interviews. And I've had people email me and message me since I've been talking about this. This is my experience. I have felt it. Yeah. I felt like I was directly harmed by God. And that is the ultimate, I think, in some sense, it's the ultimate sign of the type of thing that can, it's like the worst type of thing that can go wrong in a certain sense for people.
Yeah, that exactly. That's the triple whammy, right? I'm cut off from the place of healing. I'm wounded by the place I went to for healing. And now the God to whom I look to as a source of healing is now, assumed the villain role in the story.
You might think of it like the first thing is the abuse, and then I was abused by my religious community. So religiosity is no longer available to me to heal from trauma. I might still have spirituality. God harmed me, now I don't even have spirituality. So religion and spirituality are distinct and can be accessed differently by different people. But if you get both the anxiety in your community and the harmful God image, now you've lost access to both religion and spirituality for healing.
Okay. No, that totally makes sense. Let me shift a little bit. And as we sort of wrap up here in a second, let's talk about how we would address different audiences kind of listening to this. So if you were a pastor hearing all of this, and I love where you started. Hey, you should be running to the church to help make this a healthy community. Let's say you're in a community. What are a couple of pieces of advice maybe you'd give those of us trying to work this out in the midst of communities?
Let me just pull something up here real quick.
Yeah, for sure.
So I'm going to pull from some work now by Dr. Lisa Oakley. She's one of these few peer-reviewed researchers on this topic, and she and her colleague have begun shifting their focus away from the abuse and toward sort of like healthy, resilient spiritual communities that exemplify the opposite of abuse. Yeah. And so specifically for pastors, she has 3 questions that leaders can ask themselves.
Perfect.
So this is exactly what you wanted, and she knows more than me. Yep. So the first one is, would I want to be led by me? And let me just say, this one resonates with me because one thing I found out about myself in the 10 years since the band stopped touring, my old band Sherwood, I thought, I co-led a band. I would be a good employer. I've tried to have employees a couple times, and I am a shitty employer, man. I am so bad at it. And I would actually not want to be employed by me. Now, I think that my current editor, Josh, and I have a good thing going. I've learned a few things. I hope that he likes being employed by me. But that's a really good question, and we may not think to ask it, especially those of us like myself who are a little bit narcissistic, who have been told by people that we're smart, have a good vision, are good communicators. All that's different than being led by someone. That's not the same thing. Maybe that's a part of it is casting a vision, communication, but there's more to it than that, right?
That's so good. Tim, you will answer this question later. Off air.
Off air, yeah.
Off air.
Minimize the damage. The second,
I'll take an anonymous poll. Of one, anonymous poll of one.
Perfect.
The second question is, after people have had a conversation with me, do they leave feeling valued and respected? And what's interesting here is that what they've found in their research thus far is that healthy communities are communities where average community members feel valued and are valued and respected, and they know it. That's a key thing. So this is where, if you are a leader, you can get into the kind of thinking of, well, they might not like what I just said to them, but I gave them God's truth and that's my job. And they might not feel valued or respected, but hey, I'm a prophet. I say the truth. And if they don't listen, I wipe the dust off my sandals. Well, okay. First of all, you got a lot of confidence in your own ability at that moment. And I'm basically speaking to myself here. You know, like, how do you know that that's true? Are there smart people who love God who would disagree with you? And have you really considered their points? You know, so there's, but a good rule of thumb is if they feel valued and respected, then they are valued and respected. And it is kind of our job as leaders to communicate that to people.
Yeah.
Totally.
That's
Look at that with like parents and children. Yes, I love my child. Does your child in any way possibly know that they are loved and cherished?
Yeah, and if they don't,
with the the Mars Hill stuff is such that podcast going through that, you can see so much of what you're talking about in there. And when they talk about how they tried to come around him with like, hey, you should have these wise people come around you and kind of speak into you, and his just refusal, or almost like he was just like, you know, affected by and then turn that against somebody else. It's really wild to look at, because that's the thing that you get. It's like if you're so narcissistic that none of these things even register, it's such a big thing to tackle. Like, it's such a monster of a,
What's the third question?
The third question is, what is one thing I can do today to start to develop a healthy culture in the place I'm in? And actually, she gives that same question to congregants because one of the things that they found as they've looked at these communities is like, you know, actually non-pastors can have as much or more power than staff members in most churches. So you can imagine, you know, the Driscoll thing is unlike this because he basically built up absolute power for himself. But the church that I went to growing up, my parents were at for 35 years, it saw 4 pastors come and go. There were families and couples that were there for that whole time. Those families had more power than any one individual pastor because they basically hired and fired them, right? And so anybody can ask this question of what's one thing I can do. And I want to list off a couple things that they found in these communities. So but we already talked about people are respected, valued, and nurtured, and they know it. And that includes leaders, by the way. Leaders are respected, valued, and nurtured by their congregants and their fellow staff. Questions and disagreements must be allowed. Obviously, Mike, I know you love that. You know this is a part of my heart because I'm all about the fact that good people disagree on a lot of these things. And if we ignore that, we're just closing our eyes to the way the world actually is. They recommend leaving some interpretation up to individuals. And this ties back into that authoritarian leadership thing, right?
Yeah, for sure.
If you're not leaving any of that up to people, then you're just telling them what's true. And I got to tell you, man, unfortunately, there are 100,000 Christian denominations, and you don't know what's true. Sorry.
Right.
And if you had a debate today with Pope Francis, he would probably kick your ass. So you don't know that you're right and the Catholics are wrong, Francis. For instance.
Wow.
Don't mess with Frank.
Yeah, don't mess with Papa Frank. Yeah, and then another big one is that the process is more important than the product. And this relates to what I was saying about multiple pastors. So my parents' church, it was my church for 20 years, went through a number of important processes. One was like, do we update the sanctuary? Another one was like, do we purchase this piece of land that's right next to the church for office space and parking spaces? There's all kinds of questions about, they recently went through it. Are we going to be gay affirming? And I know this because I have friends that are on the elder board or family friends on the elder board. You're going to keep having these questions. And one thing Lisa says is some of these questions, you're literally going to decide them again in 5 or 10 years. It's like the process of the decision is what people will remember, not the product. You're going to hire and fire many people over the decades. How
That's so
do you
good.
go about it? Do people feel respected, valued, and nurtured through the process? So
Yeah. That's really good.
that's basically what
Yeah.
she's found.
What would you? And we'll close with this, buddy. This is great. To people who, on the other side of this, are sitting with those feelings of trauma, who don't feel respected and cared for, who have given up on God, Jesus, church. What hope for healing, if any, is there?
Well, there are a lot of ways to heal from trauma, and there is really good evidence that a number of therapeutic approaches, especially, are helpful. So there's really good evidence for EMDR, which is a kind of desensitization therapy. There are a lot of trauma-informed therapists who work specifically with clients who have experienced trauma. Some of these are now becoming really competent to work with spiritual trauma, religious trauma. There are not a ton of them, and they are often full. But there's the cavalry's on the way. There are more people being trained in that stuff. It's hard to know when therapy is appropriate. I can't make that decision for anybody, and it does cost money. Totally. It's a privilege. But that's sort of the way that I know best, that is the most effective means for healing. Yeah. But also, there are, support groups and group therapy for trauma survivors, and support groups are often free. Group therapy is often a half or a third the cost of regular therapy. And cool thing about group therapy is that it has been shown to be roughly as effective as individual therapy for a half or a third the cost. I myself am going to be starting up a support group in Washington for victims of religious trauma. But it's still early for all that stuff, and there aren't all that many of those groups. But you could do any kind of trauma if that's you. Look, God's not on the side of the abuser. If there's anything we know from the Bible, if anything in the Bible, if there's anything in the Bible that I am very confident is true, it is that if God exists, God is not on the side of the abusers. That is a human thing, and it's very common, and it's a big problem amongst us humans. But that's not what God wants. And if you can find a couple people who can just be with you and just hear you and not judge you, it's a great start.
That's excellent, man. Where can people find you online, bud?
Well, You Have Permission is available anywhere you get podcasts. If you happen to be in the Washington State area, I have a few client openings right now to work on this stuff with people. I'm still a student, but I'm working with a supervisor who's a trauma expert. So that's just for Washington. And you can reach out to me through the podcast about that. I'm on Twitter and Instagram, but I'm trying to actually not use them very much. So I don't know. Don't get your hopes up there.
Smart. Perfect, dude. Thank you so very much for your time, Dan. Great to see you.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you for listening to this conversation. Voxology is a 501c3 nonprofit organization that is supported by listeners just like yourself. If you'd like to partner with us, you can do so at patreon.com/Voxology. You can also join the community and hang out and chat with us on the socials. Facebook.com/Voxology Podcast and on Instagram @Voxology. Thank you for walking the long road with us.